Welcome back to the Horror Shack. Tonight, we'll explore true horror stories for sleep that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now let's get comfy. Story 1. The Haunting of Ravenwood Manor. It was 2019, and I had just finished another job, some wedding photos for a couple who thought they were going to get the next big thing. I wasn't complaining. The job paid well, but there was something missing. A spark, maybe. As a freelance photographer, I had a bit of free time on my hands, and when I heard about the old Ravenwood Manor being open to the public for tours, I figured why not? It had been abandoned for decades, and I had a curiosity about history, especially when it came to places with rumors. And believe me, Ravenwood had its fair share. The place had been built in the 1800s by a wealthy family, but everything came crashing down after a series of tragic deaths. From what I heard, the family was either murdered or died under mysterious circumstances. No one really knew the full story, and that's where the rumors came in. Some people said the place was cursed. Others claimed they saw ghostly figures in the windows. Maybe they were just stories. Who really knows? So, I decided to go. It wasn't like I hadn't seen creepy old buildings before, and I figured I could get some great photos. The manor was about an hour away from the town I lived in, deep in the woods, where the trees almost seemed to close in on the road. The closer I got, the more I noticed the silence, like the world was holding its breath. I parked at the foot of the hill leading up to the manor. There were no other cars. In fact, the whole place felt like it had been untouched for years. I grabbed my camera and walked toward the entrance, my boots crunching on the gravel. The front door was wide open, which I thought was strange. No security or guides around. The interior looked like it had been carefully preserved, as if someone was expecting visitors. The grand staircase with its oak banisters. The dusty chandeliers that looked like they hadn't been lit in decades. Everything about it screamed old money. I wandered through the downstairs rooms first, snapping photos of the faded wallpaper and cracked windows. Each room had a story to tell, but none of them seemed to be telling me anything specific. Until I reached the parlor. It wasn't much different from the rest of the rooms. Furniture covered in dusty sheets, the fireplace still intact. But there was something about this room that made the air feel heavier. That's when I saw it, a portrait on the wall, right above the fireplace. A woman, dressed in a Victorian gown, her eyes staring straight at me. She had dark hair that cascaded down her shoulders, and though the painting was clearly old, her expression was vivid, almost lifelike. I took a few shots, thinking it would make a great addition to my collection. As I snapped the photos, I felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching me. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but no one was there. It wasn't until I stepped closer to the window, ready to head out to the back garden, that I saw her again. The woman from the portrait. She was standing in the window across the hall, her figure just visible through the glass. My heart stopped. The woman, who I now assumed was the lady of the house, stood perfectly still, gazing out at something in the distance. I could barely see her face, but her dark hair and the long dress were unmistakable. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the photographer in me, but I had to take a picture. I quickly raised my camera, snapping a shot. My hands were shaking as I stared at the lens, the image beginning to develop on the digital display. But when I looked at the photo, my stomach twisted in a way I couldn't explain. There, just behind the woman, was another figure, a shadowy shape, almost like a silhouette of a man, but so dark it seemed to blend into the rest of the room. It wasn't in the room when I took the photo. I would have seen him. It wasn't until I saw the photo itself that I realized there was someone, something, standing behind me. I looked up from the camera screen, but the window was empty now. The woman was gone. I felt a chill run through me as I walked away from the parlor. my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right, and I knew it. I left the manor as quickly as I could, rushing to my car and trying not to think about what I'd just seen. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was. As I drove back home, the strange sense of unease never left me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled over to check it. The photo I had taken was still on my camera roll. But this time, when I zoomed in on the shadowy figure behind me, it looked different. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was clearer, more defined. And in the reflection of the glass, I swear I could see a hand pressing against the window from the inside. I had to pull over. I was shaking so badly, my hands were unsteady on the steering wheel. The picture was haunting, no pun intended, and I couldn't stop staring at it. It wasn't just a photo of a ghost. It was as if the mansion itself was trying to tell me something. That night, I barely slept. My dreams were a mix of shadows, the same woman in the Victorian dress, and the sound of whispers in the darkness. It felt like I was being followed, but no matter where I went, I could never see who it was. Just a lingering presence. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I decided to go back. I had to. Something about that place had gotten under my skin, and I needed answers. Maybe I should have listened to my gut when I was standing in the parlor that day. Maybe I should have just left well enough alone. But I didn't. I returned to Ravenwood Manor, this time with a notebook, ready to research everything I could find about the history of the place. I had heard there were rumors about the lady of the house, her tragic death, and how her spirit supposedly roamed the halls, seeking revenge. The locals said she was the victim of some terrible betrayal, that her husband had been unfaithful, and that it drove her mad. Some said her spirit had never left the manor. I didn't want to believe it. I told myself it was all just stories, ghost stories, rumors, legends that had been passed down through the years. But the more I looked into it, the more I realized that the people who lived around Ravenwood Manor didn't just talk about the hauntings. They believed them. I remember asking around at the local diner one afternoon, trying to get more details. The older woman behind the counter gave me a strange look when I mentioned the manor. "You don't want to go back there," she said, her voice low. "Not if you value your peace of mind." I thought she was just being superstitious, but something in her voice made me pause. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something that made her look over her shoulder, like she was afraid the walls had ears. "You heard about the woman, right?" she asked me, her eyes narrowing. I nodded, pretending to know what she meant, though I wasn't entirely sure. Her name was Margaret Blackwood. They say her spirit still wanders, waiting for someone to finish what was started. I couldn't get the woman's words out of my head as I drove back to Ravenwood, but now I felt it, the chill, the weight of history pressing down on me. But I didn't expect what happened next. The day had grown dark by the time I reached Ravenwood Manor again. The long drive up the winding, forest-lined road seemed more sinister than it did before. The trees appeared to close in around me, their skeletal branches stretching out like hands trying to pull me into the woods. I pulled into the empty parking area, my headlights casting eerie shadows across the front of the manor. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching against the gravel. There was an unsettling silence surrounding the manor, almost as if nature itself was holding its breath. The wind barely stirred the branches overhead. Even the birds had stopped singing. My heart pounded in my chest, a strange sense of dread washing over me. I didn't know exactly what I was expecting. Perhaps a ghostly figure lurking in the window again, or the odd sense that something was watching me from the shadows. But this time it felt different. The air was heavy, suffocating, as though the manor itself had been waiting for me to return. I took a deep breath and walked up the front steps, the old wood creaking under my weight. The front door, as before, stood wide open. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I had made the right decision. My camera felt heavy in my hand, but I knew I couldn't back out now. I needed to know the truth about Ravenwood Manor, about Margaret Blackwood, and the history that had haunted this place for so long. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped, sending a shiver down my spine. The grand foyer stretched before me, shadows hanging like a thick blanket. I had come prepared this time, not just my camera, but a flashlight and notebook, hoping to gather some answers. The floors groaned under my steps, the only sound in the otherwise silent manor. I wandered through the first floor once again, passing the rooms I had explored during my first visit. Everything was exactly as I remembered, except for one thing: the smell. There was an odd, metallic scent in the air, like something had been left to rot in the corners of the house. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it lingered. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, right? Then, I found myself standing in front of the parlor again, the same room where I had seen Margaret's portrait, the same room where I had felt her eyes follow me. I hesitated, but this time I stepped in. The fireplace was cold, the once luxurious carpet worn and frayed at the edges. The same faded furniture sat covered in dust. I approached the portrait once more. This time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were faint marks along the edge of the frame, almost like scratches, no claw marks. I reached out tentatively, my fingers brushing against the wood. The air around me grew cold, colder than before. Suddenly I heard it, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Leave." My breath caught in my throat. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source. The shadows seemed to shift, moving in ways they shouldn't. I swallowed hard, my hand instinctively reaching for my camera. I snapped a picture of the room, the flash illuminating the dark corners. When I looked at the photo, my blood ran cold. In the corner of the room, just beyond the shadows, I saw her again. Margaret Blackwood. Her figure was translucent, but unmistakable, dressed in that same dark, flowing gown. Her eyes, cold and unblinking, locked onto mine. She was standing just behind the old velvet armchair, staring at me with a fury I hadn't noticed before. A rush of cold air swept through the room, causing the papers in my notebook to flutter. My heart raced as I backed away, but before I could make it to the door, I heard the whisper again. It was louder now, closer. "Finish what was started." The floorboards creaked under the weight of footsteps, slow, deliberate. My skin prickled as if every hair on my body was standing on end. I turned around, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was there. I was alone, except for Margaret. Her figure had moved closer. She was now standing at the edge of the parlor, her dark eyes fixed on me. The room seemed to spin, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. "Help me. He's still here." I didn't know what to do. My legs were frozen, my feet rooted to the floor, as if something invisible was holding me in place. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam casting erratic shadows across the walls. Suddenly, the room felt suffocating, the air thick with the smell of decay and rot. The scent of death. That's when I saw him. Standing in the doorway was a tall, shadowy figure, his face hidden by the darkness. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I couldn't see his features, but I could feel the malice radiating off him like heat. He was no ordinary man. The whispering became more urgent now, a chorus of voices overlapping each other, all pleading with me. "You have to finish it," they cried. "In it now." I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, his eyes now burning with an unnatural light. His hand reached out, fingers elongating into claws. I stumbled backward, my camera slipping from my grip and crashing to the floor. The glass shattered, and I screamed in terror. Suddenly, Everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was no longer in the parlor. I was standing in the middle of a darkened room, the walls closing in on me. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. I looked around, my breath coming in short gasps. "Margaret," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" There was no answer, only silence. I turned and saw a faint light in the distance, coming from the end of the hall. I ran toward it, driven by some unseen force, my heart pounding in my chest. The light grew brighter as I approached, and soon I found myself standing in front of a door. The door was old, weathered, and cracked, but it was the only thing in the manor that wasn't shrouded in darkness. I opened it. Inside, there was a grand bedroom, lavish and ornate, as though it had been frozen in time. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, and a dressing table sat against the wall. But there, in the center of the room, was a large mirror. I stepped toward it, my reflection distorted and blurry. And then I saw her. Margaret stood behind me in the reflection, her face twisted in anguish. Her eyes were wild, pleading. "Help me," she screamed, but her voice was barely a whisper. I reached out to her, but the glass began to warp, distorting her image into something grotesque. The shadows in the mirror grew longer, darker, and suddenly I was pulled in. I gasped for air, my body jerking violently as I was dragged through the mirror. My vision blurred, and I felt like I was falling, spinning through a tunnel of darkness. When I finally landed, I was back in the parlor. Margaret stood before me, her hand reaching out, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Finish it," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "You have to set me free." The shadowy figure, the one from the doorway, loomed behind her. He was no longer a figure of darkness. He was now more defined, tall, gaunt with hollow eyes. His mouth curled into a twisted smile. "She is mine," he hissed. "She will never be free." I realized then what had to be done. Margaret's spirit was trapped in this place, bound to the manor by the curse. And the man, who I now recognized as her husband, the one who had betrayed her, had been the source of that curse. I knew I had to break it. In that moment, I grabbed the portrait from the wall and tore it from its frame. The room trembled, the air thick with the presence of something ancient and malevolent. I could feel the shadow man closing in, but I held the portrait high. "Go," I shouted, my voice breaking. "Leave her alone." The shadow screamed in fury as the portrait disintegrated into ashes. The curse lifted, and Margaret's spirit was freed. With one final look of gratitude, she vanished into the light, her eyes no longer filled with sorrow but with peace. The manor fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere that had haunted Ravenwood for so long began to dissipate. The walls stopped closing in, and the air, once thick with dread, now felt lighter. As I left Ravenwood Manor for the last time, I knew the curse was over. Margaret had been freed, and the shadows that had once lingered in the corners of the old house were finally gone. But I also knew something else. I would never forget the terror I had felt, the shadow that had haunted Ravenwood Manor for so long. Some places, I thought as I drove away, are better left untouched. Story 2. The Phantom of Oak Ridge Cemetery. In the summer of 2017, I came across something I'll never be able to explain. It's one of those things that makes you question everything, even the things you thought you knew about reality. I'm not a believer in ghosts, not at the time anyway, but I couldn't help but be drawn to Oak Ridge Cemetery. You know, the kind of place where you hear stories that make you shiver, but you think, there's no way that's real. Well, this one was different. I'm Kyle Fisher, a paranormal investigator. And in all honesty, I went into that cemetery like I always do, cautious, skeptical, but intrigued. It's not the first time I've spent the night in a place full of history and supposed hauntings. But Oak Ridge Cemetery? That place had a reputation. And that reputation was enough to draw anyone curious about the unknown to it. The kind of place where people swear they've seen figures standing in the distance and lights flicker for no reason. There were reports of voices, whispers from the past, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. And of course, the people who had been there, they claimed something was there. Something old. But when I first visited, it didn't look like much. Just an old cemetery with cracked gravestones and weeds growing in between them. But as the sun set, there was something different about the place. It felt heavier, if that's even possible. The wind seemed to pick up, almost like it was trying to push me away, but I didn't give in. I had my gear, my camera, and I was going to see if the stories were true. I set up camp near one of the older sections, near the mausoleums. They were weathered, the stone cracked with time, and it almost felt like the cemetery was trying to keep something locked inside. As I wandered through, snapping pictures, I kept hearing the faintest sound like a whisper just out of reach. I thought maybe it was just the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there with me, watching. Now, this wasn't the first time I'd heard these kinds of things before, so I didn't want to get too carried away. But as the night grew darker, that feeling only deepened. I set up my recorder, hoping to capture something. Anything that could explain what I was feeling. You know, something to show on camera. Something that would make me believe. It wasn't until around 2:30 a.m. that I caught something odd. The whispers from earlier came back, but this time, they were clearer. I couldn't understand the words, but they sounded urgent, like someone was trying to tell me something. I stood still, trying to make sense of it all, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but when I turned to face it, there was nothing there. Confused, I checked my gear. Everything seemed fine, but something in the air felt off. That's when I noticed a figure standing near one of the old mausoleums. It wasn't exactly clear, just a shape, a tall, dark figure. It stood perfectly still. I grabbed my camera, heart pounding in my chest, and began snapping pictures. It was when I reviewed the photos later that I saw something that made me freeze. In one of the shots, the figure was clearer, but what really struck me was the way it looked. The man, or whatever it was dressed in what looked like a tattered suit, old-fashioned, and weathered like something from the Civil War era. It didn't make any sense. I didn't see a person when I looked at it in real life, but there it was plain as day. I don't know why, but something inside me told me I needed to stay. It was like the figure was waiting for me to do something, maybe even invite it closer. And in that moment, I did the one thing I regret. I called out, "Who are you?" The air seemed to get colder, and the whispering started again, clearer now, like it was coming from all around me. My breath caught in my throat as I heard one word, "Run." But it wasn't just the voice. It was the feeling that came with it. My skin felt like it was crawling, like something was trying to break through to me, to reach inside my mind. The camera dropped from my hands, and I backed away from the mausoleum, not able to shake the feeling that something was following me. I left the cemetery that night, and it wasn't until I was back at my hotel that I realized just how sick I was feeling. My head felt like it was spinning, and my body was heavy. I chalked it up to exhaustion, but the nausea didn't stop. I kept seeing flashes of that figure in my mind, the tattered suit, the unsettling look in its eyes. Over the next few days, my health seemed to get worse. I started to feel lightheaded, feverish, and weak, like something had drained the life right out of me. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its dark, empty eyes staring at me. That's when I realized that I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me back. It wasn't just the illness, it was the presence. I didn't want to believe it, but the photo from the cemetery kept haunting me. I decided to publish it on my blog, hoping someone might have an explanation. I didn't expect the reaction I got. The photo went viral, and soon after, I was getting messages from paranormal experts all over the world. Some of them thought it was an impressive example of paranormal photography. Others said the man in the photo was a spirit, a Civil War soldier. They said the tattered suit was a clear sign of someone who had lived in the 1800s. But there were others who believed something much darker was at work. They suggested it was a vengeful ghost, an entity tied to the cemetery, one that had been waiting for a chance to break free. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was I just a man caught in the grip of an overactive imagination? Or had I actually encountered something that I shouldn't have? As the weeks went on, my health continued to deteriorate. I could barely function. I tried to ignore it, but every time I stepped outside, the air felt heavier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But then, a few months later, something happened that really made me question everything. I was sitting at home when I received an email from a woman named Angela. She claimed that her grandfather had been a caretaker at Oak Ridge Cemetery back in the 1940s. She said he'd told her stories of a man in a tattered suit, someone who would appear at the cemetery every time the moon was full. He would stand by the mausoleum, waiting for something or someone. No one ever knew who he was or where he came from, but Angela's grandfather always believed the man was trying to find a way out of the cemetery, a way to escape whatever he was tied to. After reading her message, I felt the same chill in my spine as I did that night in the cemetery. It was as if everything was coming full circle. But now I'm left with one question. Was I really dealing with a ghost? Or was I just the latest person to fall victim to the curse of Oak Ridge Cemetery? The strange thing is, after Angela reached out to me, I haven't been able to get rid of the feeling that he's still watching. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled in me since the first time I stepped into Oak Ridge Cemetery. The more I thought about it, the more I couldn't escape the fact that something was wrong. This wasn't just about a ghost story, a shadow, or a flicker of light. This felt real, and it felt personal. I felt like I had unknowingly awakened something I wasn't supposed to touch. I tried to go about my daily life after Angela's message, but my health was still failing. The fever wouldn't break, and the dizziness only grew worse. It wasn't just physical anymore. It felt like something was sitting on my chest, pressing down on me with every step. I couldn't sleep without seeing that figure in the mausoleum. Every time I closed my eyes, there he was, standing in the shadows, his tattered suit hanging loosely on his gaunt frame, staring at me with empty eyes. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I saw. It wasn't until one night, weeks after Angela had reached out, that I decided I had to go back. I wasn't sure if I was trying to prove something to myself, or if I was just looking for answers to put an end to this nightmare. Maybe it was the fear of the unknown, or the nagging thought that if I didn't go back, I would never be able to escape this haunting grip. So, I packed up my gear and headed back to Oak Ridge Cemetery. I went alone this time. No cameras, no lights, no distractions. Just me and the graveyard. The cemetery was just as I remembered it. The air felt heavy and cold as I entered through the rusted gates. The wind picked up, swaying the tall trees, their branches scraping against each other like fingers dragging across glass. I walked deeper into the cemetery, past rows of crumbling tombstones, the moonlight casting long shadows that seemed to stretch further than they should. I didn't know what I was expecting. Part of me thought I'd feel a sense of peace when I returned. Maybe I'd find closure, or maybe I'd just be able to shake the fear. But the deeper I went, the more I felt that strange presence surrounding me again, like the air was alive, and it was watching me. It wasn't just the cemetery anymore. It felt like the ground itself was haunted. I made my way toward the mausoleums, the one where I'd first seen the figure, the place where I had taken that photo, the one that had haunted me for months. I stood in front of it for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. The whispers from that night still echoed in my ears, the warning, the run, but I didn't run. I stepped forward, my heart pounding as I approached the structure. The air was thick, as though the very ground I was standing on was soaked with the sorrow and fear of those buried beneath it. There was a coldness that seemed to seep from the stones themselves, creeping up my legs, making my skin prickle. Then I saw him, the figure, exactly as I had remembered. He was standing there, in the same place, under the same moonlight, watching me with those hollow eyes. The air seemed to grow colder as I stared back at him, frozen in place. The wind stopped. The whispers stopped. The world around me felt eerily still. The man in the tattered suit didn't move, but I could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on me. I didn't know what to do. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if something was holding me in place, forcing me to confront whatever this was. For a long time, we stood there in silence, and then I heard it, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakably clear. "It's not over." I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something more, but the words seemed to rattle in my bones. My head spun. I couldn't think straight. "What do you want from me?" I managed to croak, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, his face obscured by shadow. But something about his stillness, the way he didn't break eye contact, made my stomach churn with dread. It felt like he was waiting for something. I knew I had to leave. My body screamed for me to turn around, to run as fast as I could, but my feet refused to move. Every step felt like I was tethered to the spot. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a sense of inevitability, like whatever had been haunting me was drawing closer, ready to claim me. I heard the whisper again, this time louder and more urgent. "It's not over." And then the ground beneath me shifted. I felt it, like something was rising from beneath the earth, a terrible force that was slowly waking up. I stumbled back, falling to the ground, my hands scraping against the cold, wet earth. My heart raced as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the cemetery seemed to be swallowed by darkness. And then, in the pitch black, I saw it, an outline of something moving, something far bigger than the man I had seen earlier. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The ground trembled as something enormous, something ancient began to rise from the earth. The figure that had been standing by the mausoleum slowly shifted, but this time, I could see more than just its silhouette. It wasn't just one figure. It was many, dozens of them, all wearing tattered clothes from the past, all standing in the shadows, watching me. I stumbled backward, my body shaking, my mind racing. What was this? Were they all ghosts? Were they spirits from the past, trapped here in the cemetery, waiting to be freed? Or was this something worse, something darker? I turned and ran. I don't remember how long I ran for. Everything blurred together in a haze of panic and fear. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I just needed to escape. I had to get out of there. The whispers were all around me now, growing louder with each step, and I could hear the heavy footsteps of something, or someone, following close behind. By the time I reached the gates of the cemetery, I felt like I had lost all sense of time. My chest was tight, my vision blurry, and I felt like I was going to pass out any moment. But somehow, I managed to get out. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the cemetery, until I could no longer hear the whispers or feel that oppressive presence hanging over me. I'm writing this now, days later, and I still can't fully explain what happened that night. I don't know if I was dealing with ghosts, demons, or something worse, but I know that something at Oak Ridge Cemetery is far beyond what anyone should ever mess with. I don't know if I'll ever go back, but one thing is certain, whatever I saw, whatever I experienced, it wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just a haunting. It was something far worse, and I'm left wondering if I'll ever truly escape it. Story 3. The Curse of Hawthorne Hollow. In 2020, Thomas Evans, a hiker and thrill seeker, visited Hawthorne Hollow, a remote forest in North Carolina, known for its mysterious disappearances and eerie, unexplained happenings. I'm not one to believe in superstitions. I mean, I grew up in a small town where every old house had its own ghost story, but I always chalked those up to local legends. But something about Hawthorne Hollow was different. It wasn't just the stories of missing people or the strange whispers you'd hear in the wind. It was the way the forest felt when you were there. It's hard to explain. You could be standing in broad daylight in the middle of the woods, but something still felt off, like there was always someone just out of sight. I guess that's why I couldn't resist visiting. I didn't go there with the intention of running into anything strange. No, I was just curious about the rumors, the stories that people whispered about, and I thought a weekend camping trip would be a great way to see it all for myself. I'd heard about the mysterious disappearances, but I thought they were probably just overblown tales meant to scare people away. People are always looking for reasons not to visit remote places, right? But after I parked my truck at the edge of the forest, something changed. I don't know how to explain it. You'd think a guy like me, who's hiked countless trails and spent nights under the stars, wouldn't be so rattled by a forest. But as soon as I stepped out of my truck, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air was thick. The trees, tall and twisted, seemed to lean toward you, like they were watching. I shook it off, though. I wasn't going to let my imagination get the best of me. I grabbed my gear and set off. The crunch of the leaves beneath my boots, the only sound breaking the heavy silence around me. I figured I'd hike for a few hours, then set up camp near the old cabin that people have been talking about for years. It was supposed to be abandoned, but some folks swore they'd seen lights flickering from inside at night. Most of the time, it was just kids looking to scare themselves, but still, the thought of it sent a shiver down my spine. As I walked deeper into the woods, it felt like the forest was slowly swallowing me. I tried to ignore the growing unease, telling myself it was just my nerves. But after about an hour of hiking, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You know how when you're alone in a quiet place, your mind starts playing tricks on you? You hear something moving behind you, or the sound of a twig snapping. But when you turn around, there's nothing there. That's how it felt. Every time I stopped to adjust my pack or take a drink of water, I felt like I was being watched. At some point, I started hearing rustling noises, soft at first, like a whisper of wind. But the longer I stood still, the clearer it became that the sounds were too deliberate, too human. I turned around, expecting to see someone else on the trail, but again, there was nothing. I couldn't help myself. I took out my phone and snapped a quick photo of the path ahead. Just the usual woods. Nothing special. But when I looked at the photo later that night, I almost dropped my phone. There was something in the background, just beyond the trees. A shadowy figure. I couldn't make out much of the person, but their eyes, they glowed. And not in the way you'd think from a reflection of light. No, these were glowing in a way that felt unnatural. Almost like they were watching me. I don't know why I didn't turn back right then. Maybe I thought it was just a trick of the light. I kept walking, determined to reach that old cabin. The eerie feeling wouldn't go away, but I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe it was the forest's dense canopy, blocking out the sun and making everything feel darker than it should have been. When I finally reached the cabin, the door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. The place was just as run down as I'd imagined. Broken windows, rotting wood, a fireplace filled with ash. But there was something unsettling about it. Maybe it was the air inside. It felt thick, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. I snapped a few pictures, trying to capture the place's haunting charm, but every time I glanced through my camera, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something just behind me. I turned but saw nothing. I should have left then, but curiosity got the best of me. I pushed deeper into the cabin. The floorboards groaned under my weight, the only noise breaking the dead silence. It wasn't long before I found something strange, a small, carved wooden figure tucked into the corner of one of the rooms. It was a little crude, like something a child would make, but it felt wrong. The carving was of a man, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. The details were unnervingly specific, almost too specific. I don't know why, but the figure made my stomach turn. I didn't want to stay any longer. The air felt colder, and my skin prickled with that all too familiar feeling of being watched. I left quickly, promising myself that I'd get back to my truck and forget all about this strange place. But as I turned to head back down the trail, I felt it again, those eyes boring into the back of my head. That night, I set up camp near the edge of the woods. The firelight flickered, casting long, trembling shadows across the clearing. I tried to push everything out of my mind and get some sleep, but I couldn't. It was the noise, the soft, whispering rustle of the trees. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. The next morning, I woke up feeling strange. My head ached, like I hadn't slept at all. I packed up my gear and started making my way out of the woods, but with every step, my dizziness worsened. By the time I reached the truck, I was sweating, my stomach churned, and my head felt like it was splitting open. It didn't stop when I got home. The headaches, the dizziness, the strange sense of unease, it was constant. I thought I was just exhausted from the hike, but as the days went on, it only got worse. That's when I looked at the photo from the cabin again. That figure in the background, the man with the glowing eyes. The local folklore I had heard about started to make more sense. It said that the land is cursed, that the spirit of an ancient settler who was wronged by the locals haunts the forest, looking for anyone foolish enough to disturb its resting place. And I think I know I disturbed something that doesn't want to be found. But what if it's not over? What if that thing is still watching me? The headaches won't stop. I keep seeing strange shadows out of the corner of my eyes. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear soft whispers in the wind. Whispers calling my name. I wish I could say that things got better after I left Hawthorne Hollow. But they didn't. If anything, they only grew worse. It started small, just little things I could explain away. I'd hear a knock at the door when no one was there, or my keys would be moved from the place I always left them. I brushed it off, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the headaches kept coming, and now they had company. Dizziness, nausea, and this strange, cold feeling that would wash over me, like I wasn't alone, like something was right behind me. I thought maybe it was the stress of hiking so deep into those woods, or maybe the lack of sleep was messing with my head. But then it started getting worse. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I noticed it, the shadows. The first time it happened, I thought it was just the moonlight playing tricks, casting strange shapes across my bedroom. But as the nights went on, I began to see them more clearly. The dark shapes moving across the walls, shifting like they were alive. I could never see their faces, but I could feel them watching me. Their presence was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think straight. It was like I was losing my grip on reality. The worst part? The whispers. At first, I thought I was hearing things like a distant voice calling my name, but it wasn't just my name. It was other voices too. Hushed, urgent whispers that came from the shadows, growing louder and more insistent every day. I tried to ignore them, tried to pretend I was just being paranoid, but the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the stronger they became. One night, when the whispers were so loud I could barely hear myself think, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I don't know why. Maybe I thought that if I went back to Hawthorne Hollow, I could put an end to this madness. Maybe I thought if I confronted whatever was haunting me, it would leave me alone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I was going back to a place that had already started to take its toll on me, and I had no idea what I would find there. The drive to the forest was long and silent. my car cutting through the thick fog that had rolled in by the time I reached the outskirts. The air was colder than it should have been for a spring evening. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to turn back, but I ignored it. I couldn't let this thing follow me any longer. I parked my truck near the same spot as before, where the trail had started. The woods looked different now. They felt darker, like the trees had closed in even more since I was last there. The air felt thick, the kind of thickness that makes it hard to breathe. I don't know what I expected to find, but I knew deep down that it wouldn't be good. I grabbed my flashlight, checked my pack, and set off down the trail once more. As soon as I stepped into the forest, the familiar feeling of being watched returned. The trees, the ones I had walked past so many times, seemed to loom closer now. The whispers started again, faint at first, but then they grew louder, filling my ears with their chilling urgency. It was as if they were calling me deeper into the woods, urging me to come closer, to listen to what they had to say. I walked for hours, the trail barely visible in the thick fog that had settled around me. Every step felt heavier than the last, like I was carrying a weight I couldn't shake off. I tried to tell myself that this was just my mind playing tricks on me, that it was all in my head. But with every passing minute, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they knew I was getting closer to something. Eventually, I reached the cabin again, but this time it was different. The door, which had been ajar before, was now wide open, like something or someone was waiting for me inside. I couldn't bring myself to go inside at first, but the whispers, they weren't just in my ears now. They were in my head, echoing inside my skull. I didn't have a choice. I stepped inside. The air inside was cold. Not just cold, but freezing. The room was dimly lit by the light from my flashlight, and I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me, like it was suffocating me. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I needed to find something to end this, to stop whatever was happening to me. I went to the corner where I had found the wooden figure before, but it wasn't there. Instead, there was something new, a journal, worn and yellowed with age, lying open on the floor. I bent down to pick it up, and as I did, a cold gust of wind blew through the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I flipped open the journal. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. It was hard to read at first, but then the words became clear. Asterisk, the curse is real. It knows when you're here. It will never leave you, asterisk. I froze, my blood running cold. I had no idea what I was looking at, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened to the person who had written this was happening to me now. I turned to the next page. There was more. Asterisk, I tried to leave, but it followed me. It knows where I am. I hear it at night, in the shadows. It's coming for me. If you find this, don't stay. Get out of the woods. Leave before it's too late, asterisk. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The whispers had stopped, but something was worse now. I wasn't alone in the cabin. The air around me felt heavier, colder. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something, a figure standing in the doorway. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. But no, this was real. A tall man standing in the threshold, his eyes glowing, just like in the photo I had taken. His face was twisted in a grotesque grin, and his hands, they were covered in dark, crumbling marks, like they had been burned into his skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, in a voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, asterisk, you shouldn't have come back, asterisk. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. My feet pounded against the forest floor as I sprinted through the trees, branches slapping against my face, my breath ragged in my chest. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away. I had to escape whatever was chasing me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled out of the woods and into the clearing where I had parked my truck. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I jumped in, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the fog, and I floored the gas pedal, not daring to look back. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. Story 4. The Lurking Shadow of Blackstone Asylum. They say that some places never forget, that the walls of abandoned buildings hold memories, not just of the people who once lived there, but of everything that happened within them. Blackstone Asylum was one of those places. It wasn't just the crumbling, peeling walls that made it eerie. It was the way it felt, heavy, as though the air itself was suffocating you. I should have known better than to go, but I was always the curious one. It was 2018, and I, Lucy Harris, had spent years building my career as a documentary filmmaker. People thought I was brave, fearless even, for seeking out the darkest, most forgotten corners of the world to tell their stories. But nothing could have prepared me for Blackstone. It was a place that had been abandoned for decades, closed down after a string of mysterious deaths among the patients, rumors about the medical staff, and whispers of patients being treated with more cruelty than care. No one had dared to step foot inside for years, except for a handful of urban explorers and thrill seekers. I wasn't after the cheap scares. I wanted to uncover the truth behind the asylum's dark past, the real story. How could so many deaths go unexplained? Why had the place been shut down so suddenly? And why did the people in the town avoid talking about it? I didn't know then, but that decision to seek out the truth would change my life forever. It started like any other investigation. I arrived at Blackstone on a cool autumn evening, the sun just beginning to set. The wind was picking up, rustling the dead leaves that lay scattered on the ground. The building was a hulking mass of decay, its tall, Gothic windows shattered and boarded up. The iron gates, once ornate and imposing, were now rusted and broken. It felt wrong. Even from the outside, it felt like something had been left behind, like the building itself was holding its breath. I set up my equipment, cameras, microphones, and a few handheld lights. The first few hours were quiet, just the sound of my boots echoing off the cracked tile floors and the occasional creak of the building settling. I kept hearing strange noises in the distance like whispers or shuffling, but when I checked, there was nothing. I figured it was just the wind or maybe the sound of rats. But as the night went on, things started to feel off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes on me from the shadows. I laughed it off, telling myself that it was just the atmosphere of the place messing with my mind. After all, I had been in my fair share of creepy locations before, but this was different. Around midnight, I found myself in the old patient ward. The rooms were bare, save for the remnants of old furniture, rusted bed frames, torn mattresses, and broken windows that let the cold air sweep through the rooms. I set up the camera to capture the entire space, wanting to get a full shot of the ward. As I was adjusting the lens, something caught my eye. A figure, standing in the far corner of the room. It wasn't clear at first. The shadows played tricks on my eyes, and I assumed it was just a trick of the light. But no, the figure was too defined. It was tall, thin, and seemed to move slightly as though it was breathing, but there was no sound. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. What was it? Who could it be? I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone. I grabbed the camera and zoomed in. My breath caught as the figure didn't move away, but stood perfectly still, watching me. It felt like hours, though I'm sure it was only seconds. I felt my blood run cold, but my curiosity got the better of me. I cautiously approached the figure, slowly moving toward the corner of the room. I didn't take my eyes off it. The camera still rolling, capturing everything. Then, just as I was a few steps away, it moved. It was so fast that I barely had time to react. The figure lurched toward me, its shape warping in a way I can't even describe. It was like watching a human form shift into something inhuman, its edges blurring and shifting like smoke. I stumbled backward, my camera dropping to the ground as I fell. I didn't hear it. There was no sound, but I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something standing right beside me. I didn't stick around to find out what it wanted. I grabbed my equipment and ran, making my way to the exit, the feeling of being chased lingering behind me the whole way. When I got outside, I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, my hands trembling uncontrollably. It wasn't until I was safely in the car, driving away, that I realized I had left the camera behind. That's when things started to get weird. A few days later, I returned to Blackstone with the intention of reviewing the footage. I wasn't sure what I expected, but when I plugged in the memory card, I was hit with the unmistakable feeling of dread. The footage from that night had everything, the figure in the corner, me approaching it, and then nothing, except for a single frame. It was blurry, but clear enough for me to make out the figure moving toward me, closer, much closer than I remembered. Its face was barely visible in the shot, but I swear, I could see something, eyes. No, that wasn't possible. It was wrong. And then, that night, the nightmares began. They were vivid, so real that I'd wake up with my heart racing, drenched in sweat. The same figure from the asylum. The same eyes, hollow, dark, like pits. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was in my room, standing at the foot of my bed, whispering something I couldn't understand. I'd turn on the light, but it would disappear, only to return again the next night. The fatigue was unbearable. I could barely sleep, barely function during the day. My friends noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I was constantly on edge. I tried to ignore it, but the figure was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started digging into the history of Blackstone Asylum. What I found didn't help. Blackstone wasn't just a place where patients were abandoned and forgotten. There were reports of strange experiments, of patients being kept in isolation, some for decades. There were whispers of rituals conducted in the dead of night. But what haunted me the most were the stories about the patients who never left. The ones who were left to die alone, abandoned by the very people who were supposed to care for them. Many of them never had family or friends to speak of, and when they died, it was like they were erased from history. But not entirely. I learned that some people believed the souls of those who died in Blackstone were trapped within the walls, unable to move on, and I wasn't the first person to feel their presence. I should have stopped right there, but I didn't. Something told me that the truth was buried in that asylum, that if I kept digging, I would uncover something that would make sense of the haunting of the figure. But every time I thought I had a breakthrough, I'd experience something more terrifying. A creaking sound in the hall when I was alone in my apartment. The feeling of something brushing past me when I was walking down the street. And the worst part, I started seeing things. Shadows. Figures. People that weren't there. It wasn't just nightmares anymore. It was real. And then, one night, I heard something I couldn't ignore. It was a voice, weak, faint, as if coming from the walls themselves. "Help us." The voice was barely a whisper, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it, or if my mind was finally starting to crack under the strain of everything that had been happening. I froze in place, the room around me feeling suddenly smaller, tighter. It was as though the air itself had thickened, pressing down on me. My heart raced, a rapid pounding in my chest, and I tried to convince myself it was just the stress, the fatigue. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This wasn't a trick of the mind. This was real. The voice had come from my apartment, the very same place I had been sleeping, where I had been struggling to ignore the creeping dread that seemed to follow me no matter where I went. But now, it was clear that the asylum wasn't finished with me. It had already taken root in my mind, and it wasn't letting go. "Help us." I couldn't breathe. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, waiting for the voice to speak again, but there was nothing. Just the heavy silence of my apartment. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone, my thoughts racing. What was I supposed to do now? I couldn't go back to Blackstone, could I? My mind screamed at me to leave it all behind. The asylum, the camera, the research, just walk away and never look back. But I couldn't. There was something in me that refused to let go. I had to know the truth. That night, sleep came in fits and starts. The nightmares returned, more vivid than ever. The figure, always the figure, standing in the corner of the room, watching me with hollow eyes. It wasn't just a dream anymore. I could feel its presence. I could hear the soft scraping of its fingers against the walls, the faint shuffle of its feet as it moved around me in the darkness. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The clock on my bedside table read 3:15 a.m. I tried to calm myself, to reassure myself that it was just another nightmare, that everything was fine. But as I sat up, my eyes fell on the corner of the room. The air felt thick again, heavy. My breath caught in my throat. There, in the corner, was the shadow, the same shadow from the asylum. But this time, it wasn't on a screen. It was right in front of me. My heart stopped. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. The shadow didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me, watching me, waiting. I could hear its breathing, soft and raspy, like someone who hadn't taken a breath in years. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but my body refused to obey. My mind screamed at me to get out of the room, but I was paralyzed by the sheer terror of it all. And then I heard it again, that voice, "Help us." But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was clearer, louder, as if it was coming from the walls, from the very floor beneath me. The room began to feel colder, like the temperature had dropped a good 10 degrees. I couldn't stop shaking. Every part of me wanted to flee, but I couldn't. I just couldn't move. Suddenly, the shadow shifted. It wasn't a figure anymore. It was a shape, a silhouette that moved fluidly, like it was made of smoke or mist. It reached out towards me, and in the dim light of the room, I could see its outline clearer than ever before. I could see the twisted, gnarled fingers stretching toward me, and I knew that whatever it wasn't human. That's when the nightmares stopped being just dreams. The next day, I couldn't function. I felt weak, like every ounce of energy had been drained from me. My eyes burned from the lack of sleep, and the voice kept echoing in my head. I couldn't get away from it. I couldn't escape it. I tried to call in sick to work, but the more I tried to ignore it, the more the presence seemed to follow me. It wasn't just in my room anymore. It was everywhere, in the hallways, in the shadows, at the corner of my vision. I had to go back to Blackstone. I had to finish what I started. I wasn't sure if I was searching for answers anymore, or if I was just trying to end this torment. But I had no choice. The second trip was worse. This time, I didn't even bother with the equipment. I didn't set up cameras or lights, or any of the things I brought with me last time. I was no longer looking for a story. I was looking for closure. I needed to end this. The moment I stepped foot inside the decaying building, the feeling hit me again. That suffocating weight in the air. The sense that something was watching me, following me. The same cold draft that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wandered through the halls aimlessly, trying to find something that would make sense of what was happening. I kept hearing noises, faint footsteps behind me, whispers at the edges of my hearing. But there was no one there. No one except for me. And then I found it. The room. It was a small, cramped space hidden in the far corner of the building. The door was cracked open, almost as though it had been waiting for me. I pushed it open slowly, the old hinges creaking with a sound that seemed far too loud in the silence. The room was bare, save for a single chair in the center. But as I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. It wasn't empty. There were markings on the walls, strange symbols drawn hastily, as though someone had been in a rush to leave something behind. And in the corner of the room, next to the chair, was a dusty old journal. My hands shook as I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped through its yellowed pages. What I read made my blood run cold. The journal belonged to Dr. Charles Whitaker, one of the head doctors at Blackstone during its final years of operation. The entries spoke of the patients, the experiments, the things they had done in the name of medicine. But there was one entry that stood out to me more than the others. It spoke of a ritual that had been performed to keep the souls of the patients alive. The entry was vague, but it was clear. Dr. Whitaker and several of his colleagues had attempted to perform an ancient ritual, a ritual that involved the transfer of souls. They believed it would grant them immortality, that they could live forever by trapping the souls of the patients inside the walls of the asylum. But something went wrong. The souls didn't stay trapped. They grew angry, restless. They became something more than just spirits, something darker. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I read the final entry. We have failed. The spirits will not let us leave. We are trapped, and they will take us all. Suddenly, the air around me grew cold. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift, and I could hear the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was, the figure, the same figure from my nightmares, standing in the doorway. But this time, it wasn't alone. I felt a presence behind me, a weight in the air, and then the whispers started. Hundreds of them, a chorus of voices, all pleading, all crying for help. And I understood. They were trapped. The souls of the patients, the ones who had died under unknown circumstances, were still there, still lingering in the walls, in the shadows, in the corners. They hadn't left. They couldn't leave. And now neither could I. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was back outside, the sun rising in the distance. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. I felt sick, nauseous, as though I had just barely escaped something terrible. Story 5. The Ghost of Lantern Hill. The encounter with the Ghost of Lantern Hill all started in the fall of 2021, when I took a trip to Maine to visit a lighthouse that had long been abandoned. The lighthouse was called Lantern Hill, standing on a craggy cliff overlooking the churning sea. From the moment I arrived, there was something about the place that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't the place itself. Well, it was old and weather-beaten, sure, but that wasn't it. It was the feeling of being watched. I thought it was just the isolation of the place, the eerie quiet. But then things started happening. Now, you've probably heard of Lantern Hill if you live in the area, or even if you've spent any time researching Maine's coastal landmarks. But what you might not know is the legend surrounding the lighthouse. It's said that the ghost of the lighthouse keeper still roams the grounds. His name was Samuel Blackwell, and he was the last keeper of Lantern Hill. According to the locals, Samuel died in a tragic shipwreck that occurred just off the coast in the 1800s. The ship was carrying a cargo of valuable goods, but it crashed in a violent storm, and all the crew perished. The thing is, no one ever found Samuel's body. They say he was swept out to sea, but a few people believe that his spirit never left. They say he still watches over the waters, still stands guard over Lantern Hill, even though the lighthouse is long since gone dark. When I first heard the story, I thought it was just that, a story. But you know how it goes. The more you hear something, the more you start to wonder, was there any truth to it? I've been traveling through Maine for a few weeks, documenting my adventures for my blog, when I decided to make a stop at Lantern Hill. I'd heard the stories, of course, but I was skeptical. Ghost stories weren't really my thing. I was more into capturing beautiful landscapes and sharing my experiences with my followers. But Lantern Hill was different. It was on the edge of a cliff, offering breathtaking views of the sea and the surrounding woods. I thought it would make for a great shot. I didn't expect anything more. I arrived at the lighthouse around late afternoon. The weather was clear, but the wind was strong, and the waves crashed violently against the rocks below. It was the kind of place that seemed like it could hold 1,000 secrets. The lighthouse itself was decaying, the white paint peeling away from the brick, but it still stood tall and proud, as though trying to defy time itself. As I approached the lighthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I figured it was just my imagination, maybe the isolation of the place getting to me, but I couldn't ignore the unease that settled in my stomach. I shrugged it off. After all, I had a job to do. I had to take photos for my blog. The door to the lighthouse was old and rusted, but it creaked open with ease when I pushed it. Inside, it was musty and dark. The air smelled like salt and decay, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. There was a narrow staircase that spiraled upward, leading to the top. I couldn't help but wonder how many times Samuel Blackwell must have climbed these steps, watching over the sea. The thought sent a chill through me, but I pushed it aside. I took out my camera and started snapping a few pictures of the view from the top. The sky was starting to darken, and the wind was picking up. It felt like the lighthouse had a life of its own, like it was still guarding something. I leaned against the railing and took a deep breath, taking in the beauty of the place, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping up on me. As I turned to leave, I snapped one last photo of the view through the window. The sun was setting in the distance, casting an orange glow over the sea. It was a perfect shot. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but when I looked at the picture later, I saw something I couldn't explain. At first, it looked like nothing, just the silhouette of the lighthouse and the sea beyond. But when I zoomed in on the window, my stomach dropped. There, in the window of the lighthouse, was a face, a man's face, staring directly at me. It was almost as if he had been standing there, watching me the whole time. I stared at the photo, feeling a sense of dread creeping over me. How was this possible? I'd been alone up there. No one had been with me. I knew that for sure. I zoomed in again, trying to make sense of it, but the face was still there, clear as day, yet no one had been in the lighthouse with me. I couldn't explain it, but then something else happened. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. It wasn't like any illness I'd ever had. It was as if something inside of me had shifted, like the ground beneath me had opened up and swallowed me whole. I stumbled back, feeling dizzy and disoriented. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had to leave. I didn't know it at the time, but that was just the beginning. By the time I reached my car, the feeling of being watched had intensified. It was as though the air around me had changed. I felt a heaviness, a presence that wasn't there before. My skin tingled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was following me. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see nothing but the empty road behind me. But there, in the reflection, was something I couldn't ignore. On my neck, just below my hairline, there were markings, faint, but there nonetheless, like scratches, but they weren't there when I arrived. I couldn't explain them. I touched the back of my neck, but the marks weren't raised or sore. They were just there. I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in that place any longer. I left Lantern Hill behind me, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just overreacting, right? It was an old, abandoned lighthouse. The wind and the isolation probably just played tricks on my mind. But the marks on my neck, that wasn't something I could ignore. I tried to forget about it. But over the next few days, I kept thinking about that face in the window. Who was it? Was it the ghost of Samuel Blackwell, still guarding the lighthouse? And why was I marked? I started looking into the history of the place, researching everything I could about Samuel Blackwell and the shipwreck. The more I learned, the more I felt a strange connection to the place, to the lighthouse, and to the spirit that was said to haunt it. The locals told me that Samuel Blackwell had never found peace, and neither would anyone who crossed his path. They said the ghost of the lighthouse keeper was always watching, always waiting. Was that face in the window a warning? Or something worse? I don't know, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. That something is waiting for me. And those marks on my skin? They've never faded. I've tried everything, but they're still there. As if Samuel Blackwell's touch has left its mark on me. Now, when I close my eyes, I can see the face in the window staring back at me. I don't know if I'll ever escape the shadow of Lantern Hill. And I wonder, will you be the next one to see the ghost of Lantern Hill? If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.